time being. The spear tip was blunted, but it was still an awesome fighting force, and easily capable of destroying what remained of Temba's paltry detachment. Sedire volunteered his men to secure the perimeters, and Loken simply waved his assent, knowing that Luke was hungry for more battle and for a chance to shine in front of the War Master. Vipers reformed the scouting parties, and Varul and Moy set up fire positions for his devastators. Loken was relieved beyond words to see that all 4 members of the Mournival had survived the fighting, though Torgadon and Abaddon had both lost their helmets in the furious melees. Aximan's armor had been torn open across his side, and a splash of red, shockingly bright against the green of his armor, stained his thigh.
"Are you all right?"
Torgadon asked him, his armor stained and blistered, as though someone had poured acid over its plates.
"Just about,"
nodded Loken. "You?"
"Yes, though it was a close-run thing," conceded Torgadon. "Bastard got me underwater and was choking the life out of me. Tore my helmet right off, and I think I must have drunk about a bucket of that swamp water. Had to gut him with my combat knife. Messy."
Torgadon's gen-enhanced body would be unharmed by swallowing the water, no matter what toxins it carried, but it was a stark reminder of the power of these creatures that a warrior as fearsome as him could almost be overcome. Abaddon and Aximan had similar tales of close-run things, and Loken desperately wanted the fight to be over. The longer the mission went on, the more it reminded him of Eidolon's abortive first strike on murder. Restored communications revealed that the Byzant Janizars had suffered terribly under the assault from the swamp, and had hunkered down in defensive positions. Not even the electro-sides of their disciplined masters were able to coerce them forward. The horrific enemy had melted back into the fog, but no one could say with any certainty where the creatures had gone. The titans of the Legio Mortis towered over the Astartes, the Dies Irae reassuring the assembled warriors by the simple virtue of its immensity. It was left to Erebus to point the way onwards, he and his depleted warriors staggering into the circle of light surrounding Petronella Vivar's crashed skiff. The first chaplain's armor was stained and battered, its many seals and scripture papers torn from it.
"War Master, I believe we have found the source of the transmissions," reported Erebus. "There is a structure up ahead."
"Where is it, and how close?" demanded the War Master.
"Perhaps another kilometer to the west."
Horus raised his sword and shouted,
"Sons of Horus, we have been grossly wronged here, and some of our brothers are dead. It is time we avenge them."
His voice easily carried over the dead waters of the swamps, his warriors roaring their assent and following the War Master, as Erebus and the word-bearers set off into the mists. Fired with furious energy, the Astartes ploughed through the sodden ground, ready to enact the War Master's wrath upon the vile foe that had unleashed such horrors upon them. Maggard and Petronella went with them, none of the Astartes willing to retreat and escort them back to the army positions. Legion apothecaries tended to their wounds and helped them through the worst of the terrain. Eventually, the mists began to thin, and Loken could make out the more distant figures of Astartes warriors through the smudges of fog. The further they marched, the more solid the ground underfoot became, and as Erebus led them onwards, the mist became thinner still. Then, as quickly as a man might step from one room to another, they were out of it. Behind them, the banks of fog gathered and coiled, like a theatre curtain in a playhouse waiting to unveil some wondrous marvel. Before them was the source of the Vox transmission, rearing up from the muddy plain like a colossal iron mountain. Eugen Temba's flagship, the Glory of Terror. 7. Watch our backs. Collapse. The Betrayer. Rusted and dead nearly 6 decades, the vessel lay smashed and ruined on the cratered mudflats, its once mighty hull torn open and buckled almost beyond recognition. Its towering Gothic spires, like the precincts of a mighty city, lay fallen and twisted. Its buttresses and archways hung with decaying fronds of huge, web-like vines. Its keel was broken, as though it had struck the moon's surface belly first,
and many of the upper surfaces had caved in. The decks below open to the elements. Swathes of mossy greenery covered the hull, and her command spire speared into the sky. Warp vanes and tall vox masts bending in the moaning wind. Loken thought the scene unbearably sad. That this should be the final resting place of such a magnificent vessel seemed utterly wrong to him. Pieces of debris spotted the landscape, twisted hunks of rusted metal and incongruous personal items that must have belonged to the ship's crew and had been ejected during the massive impact with the ground. "Throne," breathed Abaddon. "How?" was all Aximand could manage. "It's the glory of Terra, all right," said Erebus. "I recognize the warp array configuration of the command deck. It's Temba's flagship." "Then Temba's already dead," said Abaddon in frustration. "Nothing could have survived that crash." "Then who's broadcasting that signal?" asked Horus.
"It could have been automated," suggested Torgadden. "Maybe it's been going for years."
Loken shook his head. "No. The signal only started once we breached the atmosphere. Someone here activated it when they knew we were coming." The War Master stared at the massive shape of the wrecked spaceship, as if by staring hard enough he could penetrate its hull and discern what lay within. "Then we should go in," urged Erebus. "Find whoever is inside, and kill them." Loken rounded on the first chaplain. "Go inside? Are you mad? We don't have any idea what might be waiting for us. There could be thousands more of those things inside, or something even worse." "What is the matter, Loken?" snarled Erebus. "Are the sons of Horus now afraid of the dark?" Loken took a step towards Erebus and said, "You dare insult us, word-bearer." Erebus stepped to meet Loken's challenge, but the Mournival took up position behind their newest member, and their presence gave the first chaplain pause. Instead of pursuing the matter, Erebus bowed his head and said, "I apologize if I spoke out of turn, Captain Loken. I sought only to erase the gross stain on the Legion's honor." "The Legion's honor is our own to uphold, Erebus," said Loken. "It is not for you to tell us how we must act." Horus decided the matter before further harsh words could be exchanged. "We're going in," he said. The rippling fog bank followed the Astartes as they advanced towards the crashed ship, and the Titans of the Legio Mortis followed behind, their legs still wreathed in the mists. Loken kept his bolter at the ready, conscious of the sounds of splashing water behind them, though he told himself that they were just the normal sounds of this world, whatever that meant. As they closed the gap, he drew level with the War Master and said, "Sir, I know what you will say, but I would be remiss if I didn't speak up." "Speak up about what, Garviel?" asked Horus. "About this. About you leading us into the unknown." "Haven't I been doing that for the last 2 centuries?" asked Horus. "All the time we've been pushing out into space. Hasn't it been to push back the unknown? That's what we're here for, Garviel. To render that which is unknown, known." Loken sensed the commander's superlative skills of misdirection at work and kept himself focused on the point. The War Master had an easy way of steering conversations away from issues he didn't want to talk about. "Sir, do you value the Mournival as counsel?" asked Loken, taking a different tack. Horus paused in his advance and turned to face Loken, his face serious. "You heard what I told that remembrancer in the embarkation deck, didn't you? I value your counsel above all things, Garviel. Why would you even ask such a question? Because so often you simply use us as your war dogs, always baying for blood, having us play a role instead of allowing us to keep you true to your course." "Then say what you have to say, Garviel, and I swear I will listen," promised Horus. "With respect, sir, you should not be here leading this spear tip, and we should not be going into that vessel without proper reconnaissance. We have 3 of the Mechanicum's greatest war machines behind us. Can we not at least let them soften up the target first with their cannons?" Horus chuckled. "You have a thinker's head on you, my son, but wars are not won by thinkers. They are won by men of action. It has been too long since I wielded a blade and fought in such a battle, against abominations that seek nothing more than our utter destruction. I told you on murder that had I felt I could not take the field of battle again, I would have refused the position of War Master. The Mournival would have done this thing for you, sir, said Loken. We carry your honor now. You think my shoulders so narrow that I cannot bear it alone? Asked Horus, and Loken was shocked to see genuine anger in his stare. No, sir. All I mean is that you don't need to bear it alone. Horus laughed and broke the tension. His anger quite forgotten, he said. You're right, of course, my son. But my glory days are not over, for I have many laurels yet to earn. The War Master set off once more. Mark my words, Gaviel Loken. Everything achieved thus far in this crusade will pale into insignificance compared to what I am yet to do. Despite the War Master's insistence on leading the Astartes into the wreck, he consented to Loken's plan of allowing the Titans of the Legio Mortis to engage the target first. All three mighty war engines braced themselves and, at a command from the War Master, unleashed a rippling salvo of missiles and cannon fire into the massive ship. Flaring blooms of light and smoke rippled across the ship's immensity, and it shuddered with each concussive impact. Fires caught throughout its hull, and thick plumes of acrid black smoke twisted skyward like signal beacons, as though the ship were trying to send a message to its former masters. Once again, the War Master led from the front, the mist following them in like a smoggy cape of yellow. Loken could still hear noises from behind them, but with the thunderous footfalls of the Titans, the crackling of the burning ship, and their own splashing steps, it was impossible to be sure what he was hearing.
Feels like a damn noose,
said Togadon, looking over his shoulder and mirroring Loken's thoughts perfectly.
I know what you mean. I don't like the thought of going in there, I can tell you that.
You're not afraid, are you? Asked Loken, only half joking.
Don't be flippant, Garvey, said Togadon. For once I think you're right. There's something not right about this.
Loken saw genuine concern in his friend's face, unsettled at seeing the joker Togadon suddenly serious. For all his bluster and informality, Tarek had good instincts, and they had saved Loken's life on more than one occasion. What's on your mind? He asked.
I think this is a trap, said Togadon. We're being funneled here, and it feels like it's going to get us inside that ship.
I said as much to the War Master.
And what did he say?
What do you think?
Nodded Togadon. Well, you didn't seriously expect to change the commander's mind, did you?
I thought I might have given him pause. But it's as if he's not listening to us anymore. Erebus has made the commander so angry at Temba, he won't even consider any other option than going in and killing him with his bare hands.
So what are we to do?
Asked Togadon, and once again Loken was surprised. We watch our backs, my friend. We watch our backs.
Good plan, said Togadon. I hadn't thought of that. And here I was all set to walk into a potential trap with my guard down.
That was the Togadon that Loken knew and loved. The rear quarter of the crashed Glory of Terror reared up before them, its command decks pitched upwards at an angle, blotting out the diseased sky. It enveloped them in its dark, cold shadow, and Loken saw that getting into the ship would not be difficult. The gunfire from the Titans had blasted huge tears in its hull, and piles of debris had spilled from inside, forming great ramps of buckled steel like the rocky slopes before the walls of a breached fortress. The War Master called a halt and began issuing orders. Captain Sidere, you and your assaulters will form the vanguard. Loken could practically feel Luke's pride at such an honor. Captain Moy, you will accompany me. Your flame and melter units will be invaluable in case we need to quickly cleanse an area or breach bulkheads. Verulam Moy nodded, his quiet reserve more dignified than Luke's eagerness to impress the War Master with his ardor. What are your orders, War Master? Asked Erebus, his grey armoured word-bearers at attention behind their first chaplain. We stand ready to serve. Erebus, take your warriors over to the other side of the ship. Find a way in, and then rendezvous with me in the middle. If that bastard Temba tries to run, I want him crushed between us. The first chaplain nodded his understanding and led his warriors off into the shadow of the mighty vessel. Then the War Master turned to the Mournival. Ezekiel, use the signal locator on my armor to form overlapping echelons around my left. Little Horus, take my right. Torgadden and Loken form the rear. Secure this area and our line of withdrawal. Understood. The War Master delivered the orders with his trademark efficiency, but Loken was aghast at being left to cover the rear of their advance. He could see that the others of the Mournival, especially Torgadden, were similarly surprised. Was this the War Master's way of punishing him for daring to question his orders, or for suggesting that he should not be leading the spear tip, to be left behind?
Understood,
repeated Horus, and all 4 members of the Mournival nodded their assent.
Then let's move out,
snarled the War Master.
I have a traitor to kill.
Luke Cederay led the assaulters, the bulky backburners of their jump packs easily carrying them up towards the black tears in the side of the ship. As Loken expected, Luke was first inside, vanishing into the darkness with barely a pause. His warriors followed him and were soon lost to sight, as Abaddon and Aximand found other ways inside, clambering up the debris to reach the still smoking holes that the Titans had torn. Aximand gave him a quick shrug as he led his own squads upwards, and Loken watched them go, unable to believe that he would not be fighting alongside his brothers as they went into battle. The War Master himself strode up the piled debris as easily as a man might ascend a gently sloping hill, Verulam Moy and his weapons specialists following in his wake. Within moments they were alone on the desolate mudflats, and Loken could sense the confusion in his warriors. They stood awkwardly, awaiting orders to send them into the fight, but he had none to give them. Torgadden saved him from his stupefaction, bellowing out commands and lighting a fire under the Astartes left behind. They spread out to form a cordon around their position, Nero Vipers' scouts taking up position at the edge of the mist, and Breakspur climbing up the slopes to guard the entrances to the glory of terror.
"Just what exactly did you say to the commander?"
asked Torgadden, squelching back through the mud towards him. Loken cast his mind back to the words that had passed between himself and the War Master since they had set foot on Davin's moon, searching for some offence that he might have given. He could find nothing serious enough to warrant his and Torgadden's exclusion from the battle against Temba. "Nothing," he said.
"Just what I told you." "This doesn't make any sense," said Torgadden, attempting to wipe some mud from his face, but only serving to spread it further across his features. "I mean, why leave us out of all the fun? I mean, come on, Moy."
"Verulam's a competent officer," said Loken.
"Competent," scoffed Torgadden. "Don't get me wrong, Garvey. I love Verulam like a brother, but he's a file officer. You know it, and I know it. And while there's nothing wrong with that, and Emperor knows we need good file officers, he's not the sort the War Master should have at his side at a time like this."
Loken couldn't argue with Tarek's logic, having had the same reaction upon hearing the War Master's orders. "I don't know what to tell you, Tarek. You're right, but the commander has given his orders, and we are pledged to obey him."
"Even when we know those orders make no sense?"
Loken had no answer to that. The War Master and Verulam Moy led the van of the spear tip through the dark and oppressive interior of the glory of terror. Its arched passageways canted at unnatural angles, and its bulkheads warped and rusted with decay. Brackish water dripped through sections open to the elements, and a reeking wind gusted through the creaking hallways like a cadaver's breath. Diseased streamers of black fungus and dangling fronds of rotted matter brushed against their heads and helmets, leaving slimy trails of sticky residue behind. The perforated floors were treacherous and uneven, but the Astartes made good time, pushing ever upwards through the halls of putrefaction towards the command decks. Regular, static-laced communication with Cederay's vanguard informed them of his progress ahead of them, the ship apparently lifeless and deserted. Even though the vanguard was relatively close, Cederay's voice was chopped with interference, every third word or so unintelligible. The deeper into the ship they penetrated, the worse it got. "Ezekiel," said the War Master, opening the Vox mic on his gorget. "Progress report." Abaddon's voice was barely recognizable, as crackling pops and wet hissing overlaid it with meaningless babble. Moving the rat decks. We have flank, master. Horus tapped his gorget.
Ezekiel. Damn it.
The War Master turned to Verulam Moy and said, "Try and raise Erebus," before returning to his own attempts at communication. "Little Horus, can you hear me?" More static followed, uninterrupted save for a faint voice.
Ordnance deck. Slow. Shells. Making safe, but make gress.
Nothing from Erebus, reported Moy. But he may be on the other side of the ship by now. If the interference we are getting between our own warriors is anything to go by, it is unlikely our armor links will be able to reach him.
Damn it, repeated the War Master.
Well, let's keep going.
Sir, ventured Moy.
Might I make a suggestion?
If it's that we turn back, forget it, Verulam. My honor and that of the Crusade has been impugned, and I'll not have it said that I turn my back on it.
I know that, sir. But I believe Captain Loken is correct. We are taking a needless risk here.
Life is a risk, my friend. Every day we spend away from Terra is a risk. Every decision I make is a risk. We cannot avoid risk, my friend, for if we do, we achieve nothing. If the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever. You are a fine officer, Verulam, but you do not see heroic opportunities as I do.
But, sir, protested Moy, we cannot maintain contact with our warriors, and we have no idea what might be waiting for us in this ship. Forgive me if I speak out of turn, but delving into the unknown like this does not feel like heroism. It feels like guesswork.
Horus leaned in close to Moy and said,
Captain, you know as well as I do that the whole art of war consists of guessing what is on the other side of the hill. I understand that, sir, began Moy,
but Horus was in no mood for interruptions.
Ever since the Emperor appointed me in the role of War Master, people have been telling me what I can and cannot do. And I tell you I am sick and tired of it, snapped Horus. If people don't like my opinions, then that's their problem. I am the War Master, and I have made up my mind. We go on.
A squealing shriek of static abruptly sliced through the darkness, and Luke Cedere's voice came over the armor link, as clearly as if he stood next to them.
Throne! They're here!
Shouted Cedere. Then everything turned upside down. Loken felt it through the soles of his boots as a tremendous rumbling that seemed to come from the very foundations of the moon. He turned in horror, hearing metal grind on metal with a deafening screech, and watching geysers of mud spout skyward as buried portions of the starship tore themselves free of the sucking mud. The upper sections of the vessel plummeted towards the ground, and the entire ship began tipping over, the colossal rear section arcing downwards with a terrible inevitability.
Everyone get clear!
Bellowed Loken, as the massive weight of metal gathered speed. Astartes scattered from the falling wreck, and Loken felt its massive shadow like a shroud as his armor's senses shut out the roaring noise of the starship's collapse. He looked back in time to see the wreckage slam into the ground with the force of an orbital strike, the superstructure crumpling under the impact of its own weight and hurling lakes of muddy water through the air. Loken was tossed like a leaf by the shockwave, landing waist-deep in a stagnant pool of greenish scum and disappearing beneath the surface. Rolling to his knees, he saw tsunamis of mud rippling out from the vessel and watched as dozens of his warriors were buried beneath the brownish sludge. The power of the wrecked starship's impact spread from the crater it had gouged in the mud. A brackish rain of muddy water drizzled down, smearing his helmet's visor and reducing visibility to no more than a few 100 meters. Loken climbed to his feet, clearing the action of his bolter as he realized the shockwave had dispersed the sulphurous fog that had been their constant companion since landing on this accursed moon.
Sons of Horus, stand ready! He shouted, seeing what lay beyond the fog.
Hundreds of the dead things marched relentlessly towards them. Not even the armor of a Primarch could withstand the impact of a falling starship, and Horus grunted as he pulled a twisted spar of jagged iron from his chest. Sticky blood coated his armor, the wound sealing almost as soon as he had withdrawn the metal. His gen-enhanced body could easily withstand such trivial punishment, and despite the spinning fall through the decks of the ship, he remained perfectly orientated and in balance on the sloping deck. He remembered the sound of tearing metal, the clang of metal on armor, and the sharp crack of bones snapping as Astartes' warriors were thrown around like children in a funhouse. "Sons of Horus!" he shouted. "Verulam!" Only mocking echoes answered him, and he cursed as he realized he was alone. The vox mic on his gorget was shattered, brass wires hanging limply from the empty socket, and he angrily ripped them away. Verulam Moy was nowhere to be seen, and his squad members were similarly scattered beyond sight. Quickly taking stock of his surroundings, Horus could see that he lay partially buried in metal debris on the armorium vestibule, its ceiling bulging and cracked. Icy water dripped in a cold rain, and he tipped his head back to let it pour over his face. He was close to the bridge of the ship, assuming it hadn't been sheared off on impact with the ground, for surely there could be no other explanation for what had happened. Horus hauled himself from beneath the wreckage and checked to make sure that he was still armed, finding his sword hilt protruding from the detritus of the vestibule. Pulling the weapon clear, its golden blade caught what little light there was and shone as though an inner fire burned within its core. Forged by his brother, Ferrus Manus of the 10th Legion, the Iron Hands, it had been a gift to commemorate Horus's investiture as War Master. He smiled as he saw that the weapon remained as unblemished as the day Ferrus had held it out to him, the light of adoration in his steel-grey eyes, and Horus had never been more thankful for his brother's skill at the forge's anvil. The deck creaked beneath his weight, and he suddenly began to question the wisdom of leading this assault. Despite that, he still seethed with molten rage for Eugen Tember, a man whose character he had believed in, and whose betrayal cut his heart with searing knives. What manner of a man could betray the oath of loyalty to the Imperium? What manner of base cur would dare to betray him? The deck shifted again, Horus easily compensating for the lurching motion. He used his free hand to haul himself up towards the gaping doorway that led to the warren of passageways that riddled a ship this size. Horus had set foot on the Glory of Terror only once before, nearly 70 years ago, but remembered its layout as though it had been yesterday. Beyond this doorway lay the upper gantries of the armorium, and beyond that, the central spine of the ship that led through several defense choke points to the bridge. Horus grunted as he felt a sharp pain in his chest, and realized that the iron spar must have torn through one of his lungs. Without hesitation, he switched his breathing pattern and carried on without pause, his eyesight easily piercing the darkness of the vessel's interior. This close to the bridge, Horus could see the terrible changes wrought upon the ship, its walls coated in loathsome bacterial slime that ate at the metal like an acidic fungus. Dripping fronds of waving leech-like organisms suckled at oozing pustules of greenish-brown matter, and an unremitting stench of decay hung in the air. Horus wondered what had happened to this ship. Had the tribes of the moon unleashed some kind of deadly plague on the crew? Were these the means that Erebus had spoken of? He could taste that the air was thick with lethal bacterial filth and biological contaminants, though none were even close to virulent enough to trouble his incredible metabolism. With the golden light of his sword to illuminate the way, Horus negotiated a path around the gantry, listening out for any signs of his warriors. The occasional distant crack of gunfire or clang of metal told him that he wasn't completely alone, but the whereabouts of the battles was a mystery. The corrupted inner structure of the ship threw phantom echoes and faraway shouts all around him until he decided to ignore them and press on alone. Horus passed through the armorium and into the starship's central spine. The deck warped and canted at an unnatural angle. Flickering glow globes and sputtering power conduits sparked and lit the arched passageway with blue electrical fire. Broken doors clanged against their frames with the rocking motion of the ship, making a sound like funeral bells. Ahead, he could hear a low moaning and the shuffle of calloused feet. The first sounds he could clearly identify. They came from beyond a wide hatchway, toothed blast doors juddering open and closed like the jaws of some monstrous beast. Crushed debris prevented the doors from closing completely, and Horus knew that whatever was making the noises stood between him and his ultimate destination. Some trick of the diffuse strobing light threw jittering shadows from the mouth of the hatchway, and flickering after images danced on his retinas, as though the light came from a picked projector running in slow motion. As the hatchway rumbled closed once more, a clawed hand reached out and gripped the smeared metal. Long, dripping yellow talons sprouted from the hand, the flesh of the wasted arm maggot-ridden and leprous. Another hand pushed through and clamped onto the metal, wrenching open the blast doors with a strength that belied the frailness of the arms. The sensation of fear was utterly alien to Horus, but when the horrifying source of the sounds was revealed, he was suddenly seized with the conviction that perhaps his captains had been right after all. A shambling mob of rotten-fleshed famine victims appeared, their shuffling gaits carrying them forwards in a droning phalanx of corruption. A creeping sensation of hidden power pulsed from their hunger-wasted bodies and swollen bellies, and buzzing clouds of flies surrounded their cyclopean, horned heads. Sonorous doggerel spilled from bloated and split lips, though Horus could make no sense of the words. Green flesh hung from exposed bones, and although they moved with the leaden monotony of the dead things, Horus could see coiled strength in their limbs and a terrible hunger in each monster's cataracted eyeball. The creatures were less than a dozen meters from him, but their images were blurred and wavering, as though tears misted his vision. He blinked rapidly to clear it, and saw their swords, rusted and dripped with contagion. "Well, you're a handsome bunch and no mistake," said Horus, raising his sword and throwing himself forward. His golden sword clove into the monsters like a fiery comet, each blow hacking down a dozen or more without effort. Spatters of diseased meat caked the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of fecal matter, as each monster exploded with rotten bangs of flesh at his every blow. Filthy claws tore at Horus, but his every limb was a weapon. His elbow smashed skulls from shoulders, his knees and feet shattered spines, and his sword struck his foes down as if they were the mindless automatons in the training cages. Horus did not know what manner of creatures these were, but they had obviously never faced a being as mighty as a Primarch. He pushed further up the central spine of the starship, hacking a path through hundreds of organ-draped beasts. Behind him lay the ruin of his passing, shredded meat that reeked of decay and pestilence. Before him lay scores more of the creatures, and the bridge of the glory of terror. He lost track of time, the primal brutality of the fight capturing the entirety of his attention, his sword strikes mechanical and bludgeoning. Nothing could stand before him, and with each blow the War Master drew closer to his goal. The corridor grew wider as he pushed through the heaving mass of cyclopean monsters, the golden sheen of his sword and the flickering, uncertain lights of the corridor making it appear that his enemies were becoming less substantial. His sword chopped through a distended belly, ripping it wide open in a gush of stinking fluids. But instead of bursting open, the meat of the creature simply vanished like greasy smoke in the wind. Horus took another step forwards, but instead of meeting his foes head-on with brutal ferocity, the corridor was suddenly and inexplicably empty. He looked around, and where once there had been a host of diseased creatures bent on his death, now there were only the reeking remains of hacked-up corpses. Even they were dissolving like fat on a griddle, vanishing in hissing streamers of green smoke so dark it was almost black. "Throne," hissed Horus, revolted by the sickening sight of the liquefying meat, and finally recognizing the taint within the ship for what it was. A charnel house of the warp, a spawning ground of the immaterium. Horus felt fresh resolve fill his limbs as he drew closer to the multiple blast doors that protected the bridge, more certain than ever that he must destroy Yugen Temba. He expected yet more legions of the warp-spawned things, but the way was eerily quiet, the silence punctuated only by the sounds of more gunfire, which he was now sure was coming from beyond the hull, and the patter of black water on his armor. Horus made his way forward cautiously, brushing sparking cables from his path as, one by one, the sealed blast doors slowly rumbled open at his approach. The whole thing reeked of a trap, but nothing could deny him his vengeance now. and he pressed onwards. Stepping onto the bridge of the Glory of Terror, Horus saw that its colonnaded immensity had been changed from a place of command to something else entirely. Mouldering banners hung from the highest reaches, with long-dead corpses stitched into the torn fabric of each one. Even from here, Horus could see that they wore the lupine grey uniforms of the 63rd Expedition, and he wondered if these poor souls had stayed true to their oaths of loyalty. "You will be avenged, my friends," he whispered, as he stepped further into the bridge. The tiered workstations were smashed and broken, their inner workings ripped out and rewired in some bizarre new way. Meters-thick bundles of coiled wire rising into the darkness of the arched ceiling. Throbbing energy pulsed from the cables, and Horus realized that he was looking at the source of the Vox signal that had so perturbed Loken on the way in. Indeed, he fancied he could still hear the words of that damned voice whispering on the air, like a secret that would turn your tongue black were you to tell it. "Nergleth," it hissed, over and over. Then he realized that it wasn't some auditory echo from the ship's Vox, but a whisper from a human throat. Horus's eyes narrowed as he sought the source of the voice, his lip curling in revulsion as he saw the massively swollen figure of a man standing before the captain's throne. Little more than a heaving mass of corpulent flesh, a terrific stench of rank meat rose from his fleshy immensity. Flying things with glossy black bodies infested every fold of his skin, and scraps of grey cloth were stuck to his green-grey flesh. Gold epaulets glinting and silver frogging hanging limply over his massive belly. One hand rested in the glutinous mess of an infected wound in his chest, while the other held a sword with a glitter sheen like diamond. Horus dropped to his knees in anger and sorrow as he saw the slumped corpse of an Astartes warrior sprawled before the decayed splendor of the bloated figure. Verulam Moy, his neck obviously broken, and his sightless eyes fixed upon the decaying corpses hanging from the banners. Even before Horus lifted his gaze to Moy's killer, he knew who it would be. Yugen Temba, the betrayer. 8. Fallen God. Loken could scarcely remember a fight where he and his warriors had expended all their ammunition. Each Astartes carried enough shells to sustain them for most types of engagement, since no shot was wasted, and each target would normally fall to a single bolt. The ammo hoppers were back at the drop site, and there was no way they could get through to them. The War Master's resolute advance had seen to that. Loken's full capacity of bolter rounds had long been expended, and he was thankful for Aximan's insistence on subsonic rounds, as they made satisfyingly lethal explosions within the bodies of the dead things.
"Throne! Don't they ever stop?" gasped Torgadden. "I must have killed 100 or more of the damned things." "You probably keep killing the same one," replied Loken, shaking his sword free of grey matter. "If you don't destroy the head, they get back up again. I've cut down 6 or more with bolter wounds in them." Torgadden nodded and said, "Hold on. The Legio's coming again." Loken gripped onto a more solid piece of debris as the Titans began yet another deadly strafing run through the mass of rotted monsters. Like the monstrous giants said to haunt the mists of Barbarous, the Titans emerged from the fog with fists of thunder and fire. Wet explosions mushroomed from the swamp as high explosives hurled the cadavers into the air, and the crashing steps of the mighty war machines crushed them to ooze beneath their hammer-blow footsteps. The very air thrummed with the vibrations of the Titans' attack. Avalanches of debris and mud, sliding from the Glory of Terror with each explosion and titanic footstep. The dead things had gained the slopes of rubble and detritus that led into the starship 3 times, and 3 times they had sent them back, first with gunfire, and, when the ammunition had run out, with blades and brute strength. Each time they killed hundreds of their enemies, but each time a handful of Astartes were dragged down and pulled beneath the waters of the swamp. Under normal circumstances, the Astartes would have had no trouble in dealing with these abominations, but with the War Master's fate unknown, they were brittle and on edge, unable to think or fight with their customary ferocity. Loken knew exactly what they were feeling, because he felt it too.
Unable to raise the War Master, Aximand, or Abaddon, the warriors outside the hulk were left paralyzed and in disarray without their beloved leader.
Tember,
said the War Master, rising to his feet and marching towards his erstwhile planetary governor. With each step, he saw further evidence of Yugen Tember's treachery, clotted blood on the edge of his sword, and a fierce grin of anticipation. Where once had been the loyal and upright follower, Horus now saw only a filthy traitor who deserved the most painful of deaths. A fell light grew around Tember, further revealing the corruption of his flesh, and Horus knew that nothing of his former friend was left in the diseased shell that stood before him. Horus wondered if this was what Lucan had experienced beneath the mountains of 6319. The horror of a former comrade succumbing to the warp. Horus had known of the bad blood between Jubal and Loken. Now, understanding that such enmity, however trivial, had been the chink in Jubal's armor by which the warp had taken him. What flaw had been Tember's undoing? Pride? Ambition? Jealousy? The bloated monster that had once been Yugen Tember looked up from the corpse of Verulam Moy and smiled, thoroughly pleased with its work.
War Master,
said Tember, each syllable glottal and wet, as though spoken through water.
Do not dare to address me by such a title, abomination.
Abomination, hissed Tember, shaking his head.
Don't you recognize me?
No, said Horus. You're not Tember. You're warp-spawned filth, and I'm here to kill you.
You are wrong, War Master,
it laughed.
I am Tember, the so-called friend you left behind. I am Tember, the loyal follower of Horus you left to rot on this backwater world while you went on to glory.
Horus approached the dais of the captain's throne and dragged his eyes from Tember to the body of Verulam Moy. Blood streamed from a terrible wound in his side, pumping energetically onto the stained floor of the bridge. The flesh of his throat was purple and black, a lump of broken bone pushing at the bruised skin where his neck had been snapped.
A pity about Moy,
said Tember.
He would have been a fine convert.
Don't say his name, warned Horus. You are not fit to give it voice.
If it consoles you, he was loyal until the end. I offered him a place at my side, with the power of Nergleth filling his veins with its immortal necrosis. But he refused. He felt the need to try to kill me. Foolish, really. The power of the warp fills me, and he had no chance at all. But that didn't stop him. Admirable loyalty, even if it was misplaced.
Horus placed a foot on the first step of the dais, his golden sword held out before him, his fury at this beast drowning out all other concerns. All he wanted to do was throttle the life from this treacherous bastard with his bare hands, but he retained enough sense to know that if Moy had been killed with such apparent ease, then he would be a fool to discard his weapon.
We don't have to be enemies, Horus,
said Tember.
You have no idea of the power of the warp, old friend. It is like nothing we ever saw before. It's beautiful, really.
It is power, agreed Horus, climbing another step. Elemental and uncontrollable, and therefore not to be trusted.
Elemental, perhaps. But it is far more than that,
said Tember.
It seethes with life, with ambition and desire. You think it's a wasteland of raging energy that you bend to your will, but you have no idea of the power that lies there, the power to dominate, to control, and to rule.
I have no desire for such things, said Horus.
You lie,
giggled Tember.
I can see it in your eyes, old friend. Your ambition is a potent thing, Horus,
Do not be afraid of it. Embrace it, and we will not be enemies. We will be allies, embarking upon a course that will see us masters of the galaxy.
This galaxy already has a master, Temba. He is called the Emperor.
Then where is he? He blundered across the cosmos in the manner of the barbarian tribes of ancient Terra, destroying anyone who would not submit to his will, and then left you to pick up the pieces. What manner of leader is that? He is but a tyrant by any other name.
Horus took another step, and was almost at the top of the dais, almost within striking distance of this traitor who dared to profane the name of the Emperor.
Think about it, Horus,
urged Temba.
The whole history of the galaxy has been the gradual realization that events do not happen in an arbitrary manner, but that they reflect an underlying destiny. That destiny is chaos.
Chaos?
Yes,
shouted Temba.
Say it again, my friend. Chaos is the first power in the universe, and it will be the last. When the first ape creatures bashed each other's brains out with bones, or cried to the heavens in the death throes of plague, they fed and nurtured chaos, the blissful release of excess and the glee of intrigue. All is grist for the soul mills of chaos. So long as man endures, so too does chaos.
Horus reached the top of the dais and stood face to face with Temba, a man he had once counted as his friend and comrade in this great undertaking. Though the thing spoke with Temba's voice, and its stretched features were still those of his comrade, there was nothing left of that fine man, only this wretched creature of the warp.
You have to die,
said Horus.
No, for that is the glory of Nergleth,
chuckled Temba.
I will never die.
We'll soon see about that, snarled Horus, and drove his sword into Temba's chest, the golden blade easily sliding through the layers of blubber towards the traitor's heart. Horus ripped his sword free in a wash of black blood and stinking pus, the stench almost too much for even him to bear. Temba laughed, apparently untroubled by such a mortal wound, and brought up his own sword, its glinting fractured blade like patterned obsidian. He brought the blade to his blue lips and said,
The War Master Horus.
With a speed that was unnatural in its swiftness, the tip of the blade speared for the War Master's throat. Horus threw up his sword, deflecting Temba's weapon barely a centimetre from his neck, and took a step backwards as the traitor lurched towards him. Recovering from the surprise attack, Horus gripped his sword two-handed, blocking every lethal thrust and cut that Temba made. Horus fought like never before, his every move to parry and defend. Yugen Temba had never been a swordsman, so where this sudden, horrifying skill came from, Horus had no idea. The two men traded blows back and forth across the command deck, the bloated form of Yugen Temba moving with a speed and dexterity quite beyond anything that should have been possible for someone of such vast bulk. Indeed, Horus had the distinct impression that it was not Temba's skill with a blade that he was up against, but the blade itself. He ducked beneath a decapitating strike and spun inside Temba's guard, slashing his sword through his opponent's belly, a thick gruel of infected blood and fat spilling onto the deck. The dark blade darted out and struck his shoulder guard, ripping it from his armor in a flash of purple sparks. Horus danced back from the blow as the return stroke arced towards his head. He dropped and rolled away as Temba turned his bloody, carven body back towards him. Any normal man would have died a dozen times or more, but Temba seemed untroubled by such killing wounds. Temba's face shone with glistening sweat, and Horus blinked as the monster's outline wavered, like those of the cyclopean monsters that he had fought in the ship's central spine. Frantic motions shimmered, and he could see something deep within the monstrously swollen body, the faint outline of a screaming man, his hands clasped to his ears and his face twisted in a rictus grin of horror.
Trailing his innards like gooey ropes, Eugen Tember descended the steps of the dais like a socialite making her entrance at one of the American balls. Horus saw the cursed sword gleaming with a terrible hunger, its edges twitching in Tember's hand, as though aching to bury itself in his flesh.
"It doesn't have to end this way, Horus," gurgled Tember. "We need not be enemies."
"Yes," said Horus, "we do. You killed my friend and you betrayed the Emperor. It can be no other way." Even before the words were out of his mouth, the smoky grey blade streaked towards him, and Horus threw himself back as the razor-sharp edge grazed his breastplate and cut into the ceramite. Horus backed away from Tember, hearing twin cracks as the monstrously bloated traitor's ankle bones finally snapped under his weight. Horus watched as Tember dragged himself forwards unsteadily, the splintered ends of bone jutting from the bloody flesh of his ankles. No normal man could endure such agony, and Horus felt a flickering ember of compassion for his former friend stir within his breast. No man deserved to be abused so, and Horus vowed to end Tember's suffering, seeing again the jagged afterimage sputtering within the alien flesh of the warp.
"I should have listened to you, Eugen,"
he whispered. Tember didn't reply. The glimmering blade wove bright patterns in the air, but Horus ignored it, too seasoned a warrior to be caught by such an elementary trick. Once again, Tember's blade reached out for him, but Horus was now gaining a measure of its hunger to do him harm. It attacked without thought or reason, only the simple lust to destroy. He looped his own blade around the quillons of Tember's sword and swept his arm out in a disarming move, before closing to deliver the death blow. Instead of releasing the blade for fear of a shattered wrist, however, Tember retained his grip on the sword, its tip twisting in the air and plunging towards Horus's shoulder. Both blades pierced flesh at the same instant, Horus's tearing through his foe's chest and into his heart and lungs, as Tember's stabbed into the muscle of Horus's shoulder where his armor had been torn away. Horus yelled in sudden pain, his arm burning with the shimmering sword's touch, and reacted with all the speed the Emperor had bred into him. His golden sword slashed out, severing Tember's arm just above the elbow, and the sword clanged to the deck where it twitched in the grip of the severed arm with a loathsome life of its own. Tember wavered and fell to his knees with a cry of agony, and Horus reared above his foe with his sword upraised. His shoulder ached and bled, but victory was now his, and he roared with anger as he stood ready to enact his vengeance. Through the red mist of anger and hurt, he saw the pathetic weeping and soiled form of Eugen Tember, stripped of the loathsome power of the warp that had claimed him. Still bloated and massive, the dark light in his eyes was gone, replaced by tears and pain as the enormity of his betrayal crashed down upon him.
"What have I done?"
asked Tember, his voice little more than a whisper. The anger went out of Horus in an instant, and he lowered his sword, kneeling beside the dying man that had once been his trusted friend. Juddering sobs of agony and remorse racked Tember's body, and he reached up with his remaining hand to grip the War Master's armor.
"Forgive me, my friend,"
he said.
"I didn't know. None of us did."
"Hush now, Eugen," soothed Horus. "It was the warp. The tribes of the moon must have used it against you. They would have called it magic."
"No, I'm so sorry,"
wept Tember, his eyes dimming as death reached up to claim him.
"They showed us what it could do, and I saw the power of it. I saw beyond and into the warp. I saw the powers that dwell there, and... Emperor, forgive me. I still said yes to it."
"There are no powers that dwell there, Eugen," said Horus. "You are deceived."
"No,"
said Tember, gripping Horus's arm tightly.
"I was weak, and I fell willingly. But it is done with me now. There is great evil in the warp, and I need you to know the truth of chaos before the galaxy is condemned to the fate that awaits it."
"What are you talking about? What fate?"
"I saw it, War Master. The galaxy has a wasteland. The Emperor dead, and mankind in bondage to a nightmarish hell of
bureaucracy and superstition. All is grim darkness, and all is war. Only you have the power to stop this future. You must be strong, War Master. Never forget that.
Horus wanted to ask more, but watched impotently as the spark of life fled Yugen Temba. His shoulder still burning with fire, Horus rose to his feet and marched over to the rewired consoles and the throbbing bundle of cables that reached up to the chamber's roof. With an aching cry of loss and anger, he severed the cables with one mighty blow of his sword. They flopped and spun like landed fish, sparks and green fluid spurting from internal tubes and cables, and Horus could tell that the damnable Vox transmission had ceased. Horus dropped his sword and, clutching his injured shoulder, sat on the deck next to Yugen Temba's dead body and wept for his lost friend. Loken hacked his sword through another corpse's neck, dropping the mouldering revenant to the ground as still more pressed in behind it. He and Torgadden fought back to back, their swords coated in the flesh of the dead things as they were pushed further and further up the slopes of metal that led inside the starship. Their warriors fought desperately, each blow leaden and exhausted. The titans of the Legio Mortis crushed what they could and sporadically raked the base of the rubble with sprays of gunfire, but there was no stopping the horde. Dozens of Astartes were dead, and there was still no word from the forces that had entered the glory of Terra. Garbled Vox transmissions from the Byzant Janizars seemed to indicate that they were finally moving forward, but no one could be sure as to where exactly they were moving. Loken fought with robotic movements, his every blow struck with mechanical regularity rather than skill. His armor was dented and torn in a dozen places, but still he fought for victory, despite the utter desperation of their cause. That was what Astartes did. They triumphed over insurmountable odds. Loken had lost track of how long they had been fighting, the brutal sensations of this combat having dulled his senses to all but his next attacker.
"We'll have to pull back into the ship," he shouted.
Torgadden and Nero Vipers nodded, too busy with their own immediate situations to respond verbally, and Loken turned and began issuing orders across the intersuit Vox, receiving acknowledgments from all his surviving squad commanders. He heard a cry of anger, and recognizing it as belonging to Torgadden, turned with his sword raised. A mob of stinking cadavers swamped the top of the slopes, overwhelming the Astartes gathered there in a frenzy of clawing hands and biting jaws. Torgadden was borne to the ground, and the mouths of the corpses fastened on his neck and arms were dragging him down.
"No!"
shouted Loken, as he leapt towards the furious combat. He shoulder-charged in amongst them, sending bodies flying down the slopes. His fists crushed skulls, and his sword hacked dead things in two. A gauntleted fist thrust up through grey flesh, and he grabbed it, feeling the weight of an armoured Astartes behind it.
"Hold on, Tarek,"
he ordered, hauling on his friend's arm. Despite his strength, he couldn't free Torgadden, and felt grasping limbs envelop his legs and waist. He clubbed with his free hand, but he couldn't kill enough of them. Hands tore at his head, smearing blood across his visor and blinding him as he felt himself falling. Loken thrashed in vain, breaking dead things apart, but unable to prevent himself and Torgadden from being pulled apart. Claws tore at his armor, the unnatural strength of their enemies piercing his flesh and drawing his precious blood. A grinning, skull-faced monster landed on his chest, face to face with him, and its jaws snapped shut on his visor. Unable to penetrate the armored glass, rivulets of muddy saliva blurred his vision as its jaws worked up and down. Loken head-butted the thing from his chest and rolled onto his front to gain some purchase. He lost his grip on his sword and bellowed in anger as he finally began to free himself from their intolerable grip. Loken fought with every ounce of his strength, finally gaining a respite and rising to his feet. All around him, warriors of the Astartes struggled with the dead things, and he knew that they were undone. Then, at a stroke, every one of the dead things dropped to the ground with a soft sigh of release. Where seconds before the area around the starship had been a furious battlefield of warriors locked in life-or-death struggles, now it was an eerily silent graveyard. Bewildered Astartes picked themselves up and looked around at the inert, lifeless bodies surrounding them.
What just happened? Asked Nero Vipers, disentangling himself from a pile of bludgeoned corpses. Why have they stopped? Loken shook his head. He had no answer to give him.
I don't know, Nero.
It doesn't make any sense.
You'd rather they got back up?
No, don't be dense. I just meant that if someone was animating these things, then why stop now? They had us. Loken shuddered. For someone to wield a power that could defeat the Astartes was a sobering thought. All the time they had crusaded through the galaxy, there had been nothing that could stand against them for long. Eventually the enemy's will would break in the face of the overwhelming superiority of the Space Marines. Would this happen when they met a foe with a will as implacable as their own? Shaking himself free of such gloomy thoughts, he began issuing orders to dispose of the dead things, and they began hurling them from the wreckage, hacking or tearing heads from shoulders lest they reanimate. Eventually, Aximand and Abaddon led their warriors from the wreckage, battered and bloody from the ship's fall, but otherwise unharmed. Erebus, too, returned, his word-bearers similarly abused, but also largely unharmed. There was still no sign of Cedere's men, or the War Master. "We're going back in there for the War Master," said Abaddon. "I'll lead." Loken was about to protest, but nodded as he saw the unshakable resolve in Ezekiel's face.
"We'll all go," he said.
They found Luke Cedere and his men trapped in one of the lower decks, hemmed in by fallen bulkheads and tons of debris. It took the better part of an hour to move enough of it to grant Luke's assaulters their freedom. On pulling Cedere from his prison, all he could say was, "They were here. Monsters with one eye. Came out of nowhere, but we killed them. All of them. Now they're gone." Luke had suffered casualties. 7 of his men were dead, and his perpetual grin was replaced by a vengeful expression that reminded Loken of a defiant young boy's. Black, stinking residue coated the walls, and Cedere had a haunted look to him that Loken did not like at all. It reminded him of Euphrates Keeler in the moments after the warp thing that had taken Jubal almost killed her. With Cedere and his warriors in tow, the Mournival pressed on, with Loken leading the way, finding signs of battle scattered throughout the ship, bolter impacts and sword cuts that led inexorably towards the ship's bridge.
"Loken,"
whispered Aximand.
"I fear what we may find ahead. You should prepare yourself."
"No," said Loken.
"I know what you are suggesting, but I won't think of that. I can't. We have to be prepared for the worst."
"No," said Loken, louder than he had intended.
"We would know if..."
"If what?" asked Torgadden.
"If the War Master was dead,"
said Loken finally. Thick silence enveloped them as they struggled to come to terms with such a hideous idea. "Loken's right," said Abaddon. "We would know if the War Master was dead. You know we would. You of all of us would feel it, little Horus."
"I hope you're right, Ezekiel."
"Enough of this damned misery," said Torgadden. "All this talk of death, and we haven't found hide nor hair of the War Master yet. Save your gloomy thoughts for the dead that we already know about. Besides, we all know that if the War Master was dead, the sky would have fallen, eh?" That lightened their mood a little, and they pressed on, making their way along the central spine of the ship, passing through juddering bulkheads and along corridors with flickering lights, until they reached the blast doors that led to the bridge. Loken and Abaddon led the way, with Aximand, Torgadden, and Cedere bringing up the rear. Inside it was almost dark, only a soft light from ruptured consoles providing any illumination. The War Master sat with his back to them, his glorious plate armor dented and filthy, cradling something vast and bloated in his lap. Loken drew level with the War Master, grimacing as he saw a grotesquely swollen human head in his commander's lap. A great puncture wound pierced the War Master's breastplate, and a bloody stab wound on his shoulder leaked blood down the armor of his arm.
"Sir,"
said Loken.
"are you all right?"
The War Master didn't answer, instead cradling the head of what Loken could only assume was Yugen Temba. His bulk was immense, and Loken wondered how such a monstrously fat creature could possibly have moved under his own strength. The Mournival joined Loken, shocked and horrified at the War Master's appearance, and at this terrible place. They looked at one another with a growing unease, none quite knowing what to make of this bizarre scene.